Geez, so it's not so often that I make a video like this, but frankly, I'm pretty pissed off, right? It may not be a surprise to you to hear me say that the Canadian government is failing us, but they seem to keep on coming up with new ways to do so, and new and surprising ways, right? Ways that leave everyone involved in the situation looking stupid, while Canadians have to foot a bill for potentially over $1 million. Let me give you a little bit of context. You've probably already heard of all of the mounting evidence and allegations of interference from China in our elections. We're not going to go over all the specifics, but it's something that's been coming up over and over and over again, so much so that the government said, okay, we got to take this seriously. We're going to hire a special investigator to get to the bottom of this and decide if we need a public inquiry or not. So the Liberal government and Trudeau selected a special investigator, David Johnston, to get to the bottom of it. So his report came back just a little while ago, and it said that there's actually no point in us holding a public inquiry. You can just trust me to get to the bottom of this. Now, this all ties into the $1 million plus potential bill that we could be footing, as well as the sort of handshake perfect plan deal between two politicians that is backfiring for the person who thought it would be the best for them. But first, we need to get into some new allegations that are coming out that make this whole situation even worse. The leader of the Conservative Party during our last elections was told just a couple of days ago that, hey, actually, you were being targeted directly.
The former Conservative leader said CSIS told him he was in China's crosshairs.
My parliamentary caucus and myself were the target of a sophisticated misinformation and voter suppression campaign
to get this country back on track.
Aaron O'Toole said Beijing targeted him before, during, and after the 2021 election.
Each of these threats were intended to discredit me, promote false narratives about my policies, and to severely obstruct my work.
O'Toole says money was funneled to organizations to amplify misinformation about him, and that China worked through its overseas United Front Work Department. The UFWD creates a web of dozens and dozens of Chinese hometown associations across Canada to influence the political views of its diaspora.
All this to say that the temperature on this issue has continued to rise and rise and rise over and over again, so much so that we need to get to this $1 million thing that I've been talking about, because David Johnston, the special investigator charged with looking into this, largely so that we can avoid a public inquiry that would cost a lot of money to put on, has now hired a PR firm that is going to help him with crisis management. This CBC article claims that a crisis communications agency was hired for David Johnston, and the taxpayers are footing the bill. They say that they hired Navigator, which is this firm for communications advice and support. And Navigator describes itself as a high-stakes strategic advisory and communications firm. And you might actually be familiar with this organization because it's the same group of people that helped Hockey Canada last summer when they were dealing with the allegations that they were using player registration fees to cover up sexual assault allegations in their national hockey program. And it's also the same organization that was used by Ottawa Police Chief before he resigned from his position during the trucker sort of situation that was going down in Ottawa last year. Now, because David Johnston's investigation into interference is still ongoing, we don't know what the total bill will be here for this situation, but we can look to historical ones to find out, okay, how much could the public be paying for this? And if we look at Hockey Canada's situation, they spent $1.6 million on hiring Navigator to help them through this situation, so it's not unreasonable to think that the bill for David Johnston, in a matter of national security with the deep pockets of the government, that they could be charged upwards of $1 million. And now non-liberal politicians of all stripes, both NDP, Conservative, and Bloc Québécois, are all saying, okay, we're actually not so happy with David Johnston being your special investigator. We don't like the findings of his report, and so much so that the NDP, one of the historic allies of the Liberals over the past number of months when it comes to a number of different issues, well, they're turning against the Liberals. Look at this.
We have a motion today. We want to see all members of this House support our motion, calling for Mr. Johnston to be removed as special rapporteur and to have a public inquiry.
What happens if the motion passes, but the government doesn't do what the motion says? They keep David Johnston there. What are the consequences? Are there any?
Well, first of all, the consequences are Canadians going to see that that the Prime Minister is no longer putting the interests of the country in front of his own personal interests. There's really no reason now to continue with Mr. Johnston when it's become very clear that this is nothing personal about Mr. Johnson or his credibility, but the appearance of bias is too strong that it undermines the work that the Prime Minister hoped that Mr. Johnson would be able to do. So they would show that he's no longer putting the interest of really restoring confidence of democracy, and he's more interested in protecting a position that he's taken, which no longer makes sense.
Now, it's very important to understand that this man, Jagmeet Singh, holds a lot of power right now as leader of the NDP, because the NDP have largely been keeping the Liberal government in power. About a year ago, they signed something called the Supply and Confidence Agreement, essentially a laundry list of things that the NDP said, if you commit to doing these things, we won't trigger an election by voting against you on an important issue, a vote of no confidence. So if the NDP say, okay, this is a very important issue for me, the fact that we're not having a public inquiry, we want one, so much so that they're holding this motion and having this motion where they can have all parliamentarians vote against David Johnston being the special investigator, well, then you might think, okay, well, maybe he'll actually trigger an election over this. And here's the text of the motion that was just voted on in the House of Commons, and one of many things that it calls for is to call on the Right Honourable David Johnston to step aside from his role as the Special Rapporteur, Special Investigator, and call on the government to urgently establish a public commission of inquiry, and it goes on to sort of describe how this public commission would look, what it would look like. Okay, so that's what everyone was voting on, and when you look at the results of the vote up here, you'll see that it actually passed. The House of Commons wants David Johnston to step down, 174 votes to 150, a clear win. But not only have the members of Parliament lost faith in David Johnston as this special investigator, also the Canadian public, based on this recent poll from Leger, says that they've lost the faith in him too, with only 27% of Canadians saying yes, that they believe that the recommendations made by David Johnston are based on foreign policy expertise and rigorous impartial work, effectively signaling that only 27% of Canadians have faith in David Johnston's work in being accurate and effective. So given that everybody on all sides other than the Liberals don't want this guy to continue, you would think that maybe Trudeau and the Liberals would say, okay, we understand that both the public and members of Parliament think that this isn't the right way to go. Let's relent, let's make a change. Well, here's what he actually said.
David Johnston has lost the confidence of the House. Leger poll says only 27% of Canadians have confidence in him. Can you continue to ignore calls to replace him?
What is unfortunate is that the leaders of both the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois have refused to let facts get in the way of the political arguments and personal attacks that they're making. They have refused to get security briefings on the actual facts surrounding the intelligence and the question of foreign interference, because they want to continue to smear a man of unimpeachable integrity and deep commitment and service to Canada. He will continue his work in sharing with Canadians the concerns and the solutions around foreign interference. And I look forward to him holding public hearings across the country over the coming months to include Canadians in this important conversation in a way that is grounded in facts. This is a serious issue. Unfortunately, the leader of the opposition is not choosing to take it seriously. He's choosing instead to fling mud and make personal attacks. That's not responsible leadership.
Largely a deflection of the question and a deflection of any concerns about Trudeau and his decisions and his choices in this matter, and sort of pushing that target onto opposition leaders. One of the main things that he says here is like, how can you trust these opposition leaders? Both the Bloc Québécois and the Conservative leader haven't agreed to get a briefing on all the details of this situation, leaving out conveniently the fact that in order for them to get that briefing, they would have to be sworn to secrecy about that briefing. So essentially, they wouldn't be able to talk about this issue in public because of the national security level clearance they would need to get and the secrecy connected to that in order to actually see the things that Trudeau's talking about. So both the Bloc and the Conservatives are saying, well, heck no, we're not going to say yes to taking this oath of secrecy if it means that we can't talk about what we see in these documents, even in an abstract way, saying that there's a problem here. But even though the vast majority of politicians in the House of Commons and the vast majority of Canadians are at the very least unsure about whether or not David Johnston is a good fit for this role and if it's actually helping Canada in general, despite all of that, Trudeau is not forced to make him resign, even though this vote went through. A motion in the House of Commons context, when it's sort of put forward by an opposition leader or an opposition government, well, it's not binding. It doesn't make them do anything. It's just a signaling of the opinion of the members of parliament at that point in time about a given issue, and the government that's in power can either take that or leave it. But remember, Jagmeet Singh of the NDP has the power here. If he wants to force a vote of no confidence and stop supporting the Liberals over this issue, he could plunge us into an election, or he could at the very least threaten that so that the Liberals will do something. So is this something that he's going to do? Well, here's this clip. Listen in on this.
Possibly continue to support the government if they do not agree with your motion. You just said he would have put the country's interest behind his own. How can you continue to support him then?
Well, let's look at that. We've got an agreement where there's 27 things that this government has to do to help Canadians. If we move away from that agreement, we're going to let the Liberals off the hook. The Liberals don't want to do these things. They didn't want to bring in dental care. They don't want to bring in pharmacare. They don't want to bring in protections for workers. They don't want to do any of these things. So if we get rid of the agreement, it's just going to let the Liberals off the hook. I'm not going to let them off the hook. We force them to commit to these things. We're going to make sure they follow through on these things. They would love to get out of this agreement so they don't have to deliver on pharmacare and dental care. We're going to continue to push to deliver the things that Canadians need, because Canadians need a break.
I'm not going to let Trudeau off the hook. I'm not going to let the Liberals off the hook. But can't you see that's exactly what you're doing now, just not on the issues that you care about, but the issues that many other Canadians care about, which is this election interference and democracy credibility issue. And what issue could be, oh my gosh, I can't talk. What issue could be more important than that? The original point of this whole agreement between the Liberals and the NDP was supposed to make the NDP look good. We did these things for Canadians by forcing the Liberals to do things that they didn't want to do, which is fair. There are a number of different things that wouldn't have actually come to fruition if it were not for this agreement and the pressure of the NDP, like the things he mentioned there. The Canada dental benefit probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for this deal. But now the tables have turned and the plan is totally backfiring. The Liberals know that they can take credit for these things that the NDP say they're forcing them to do, because most Canadians won't understand the nuance of the situation. They can just say, hey, look at all these awesome things we do and the things that we've done and implemented for Canadians without sort of mentioning that the NDP forced them to do it. And even more so, this deal essentially protects him from being accountable for any of this interference allegations because of what we just heard in this clip from Singh. He just said that they won't force a vote of no confidence because then the rest of the things that they want to get done as a part of this deal with the Liberals won't happen. So now Trudeau and the Liberals know that any threat of the NDP withdrawing their support is just a bluff and it's not real, because they want to get things done for Canadians. Now, critics will say that their true concern is polling numbers. The NDP's true concern is polling numbers, and how there's a chance that if they do trigger an election, they could end up losing power. So the NDP's plan to use this deal to make themselves look good and get more power is totally backfiring, and it's making Singh look awful, to be frank. With that said, I have to be honest. I've got to hand it to Trudeau and the Liberals. If you look at it through their eyes and how they'd be viewing their political strategy, everything is working perfectly as intended. The investigator that they selected said that they didn't need to hold a public inquiry that could potentially damage the Liberals' image. And even when both Canadians and MPs alike are calling bullshit on this special investigator's credibility and the findings of his report, well, there's nothing that Canadians or politicians can do, even if there's a vote, which there was, and even if the Liberals lose that vote, which they did, because Singh won't make this an election-triggering decision, well, they won't be held accountable and they can just do whatever they want to do, and David Johnston will continue his report, which will go on till October, maybe September of this year, and Canadians will lose interest and we'll be on to the next issue, and the current government will still be intact. This is masterful, masterful political maneuvering by Trudeau and the Liberals, if you ask me, even if it comes at the cost of the trust of the public in our democracy. And now the end result is that politically connected firms like the Navigator and other firms that have been tied to this investigation are getting consistent paydays because of their connections with these Ottawa politicians. I feel like I just went on a big rant, but I'm frustrated, so I wanted to take a little bit of time out of my Saturday morning and make this video and let you know my read on the situation, what's going on. If you appreciate videos like this, hit the subscribe button. About 50% of the people that watch these videos aren't subscribed, so if you're one of them, it helps out the channel dramatically, and it's just a free click. I appreciate that. Let me know what you think down in the comments about this entire situation. There's going to be lots of different opinions, but with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.